Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here from the Department of Criminal Justice at the University of Central Florida, and I'd like to spend a few minutes discussing research methods when studying terrorism. First, there's no reason to believe that research methods studying terrorism are dramatically different than research methods studying any other type of criminal activity. Obviously, there may be some adjustments to make, but if you've taken a course on research methods, certainly you did at the undergrad level, maybe you have at the grad level as well, or you will be, all those methods apply. You're just applying them to different terrorist groups or terrorist individual terrorists or terrorist counterterrorism policies and so on. But one of the things I always like to do is to think about what is going on in the field. How do we assess the field? How do we understand what's being used, and what is being researched? And so what I'd like to do, and I posted this article for you, it's linked, is Dr. Bart Sherman's 2019 article, Topics in Terrorism Research, Reviewing Trends and Gaps, from 2007 to 2016. So he looks at a 10-year period, and that was published in Critical Studies on Terrorism, Volume 12, Issue 3, pages 463 to 480. So Dr. Sherman looks at 9 leading terrorism journals, and he does an analysis to see what type of articles are presented. What do they focus on? What do they emphasize? He found that basically, and we'll get into a little bit of the details, that there was an overemphasis on specific groups and threats, and less attention to other groups and threats. So it wasn't a balanced approach, really, but there was a inherent interest in studying particular groups and behaviors, activities. The 9 journals that he used in his study were Terrorism and Political Violence, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, Perspectives on Terrorism, Combating Terrorism Sentinel, the Critical Studies on Terrorism, the Dynamic Asymmetric Conflict, Pathways Toward Terrorism and Genocide, Behavioral Sciences of Terrorism and Political Aggression, the Journal for De-Radicalization, and the Journal of Terrorism Research. What's important to recognize is that while these journals focus primarily on terrorism, that there's literally hundreds of other journals that have excellent, popular, well-established, and useful articles on terrorism. So, I think I mentioned before that I have some articles that I use from a journal, Homicide Studies on Terrorism. So obviously that journal focuses on homicide. One of the areas is terrorism. So we'll see that in many, many journals across disciplines. Professor Sherman looked at 2,552 articles with a focus on keywords. And frequently used keywords were Al-Qaeda, jihadism, Iraq, United States, counterterrorism, war on terror, Afghanistan, Syria, and the Islamic State. And that Syrian Islamic State especially became more popular after 2014. There was some interest in lone actor terrorism, foreign fighters, the internet, and radicalization, but 74.5% of the articles focused on jihadist groups. The least researched, and this is of great concern to me as a researcher, were non-jihadist religious groups, state terrorism, right-wing extremist terrorism, pro-government militias, drug cartels, animal rights terrorist groups, environmental activism terrorist groups, and other single-issue terrorist groups. So what we find is that there is indeed an overemphasis on certain types of terrorism and much, much less attention paid to others. Also, the geographic focus has tended to be the Middle East and North Africa. And so we see this consistency in that 10-year period. Of course, it would be interesting to see what has happened in the last few years, but we have a publication lag, and by the time you finish collecting your data and then you write up your results and then you publish, a year or two may have transpired. Also, what we see, and Dr. Sherman points this out, is that often the research tends to mirror the state's terrorism-related concern. So if we look at United States policy, focus, and emphasis as it relates to terrorism, we see that many times researchers follow that particular avenue. And so we have to ask, and Dr. Sherman points out, how do we connect with policymakers and journalists, especially if we're not experts in the particular concern of the day? For example, I get periodic interviews from the media on homicide cases, especially if it relates to a shooting or serial murder or an act of terrorism or something of that sort. I may have an interview on that, but I can't really recall being interviewed about genocide or being interviewed about genocide in Sudan or the Bosnian genocide. And so a lot of times we're going to see that researchers, academics, those working in think tanks are going to follow, basically where the funding is at and where the focus is at. And that's difficult to change. I mean, that can become problematic. Also, we run into the situation of who is considered to be a terrorism expert. And so we know after 9/11 happened, or on 9/11, let me actually grab that book. On 9/11, after the terrorist attack was televised, I knew my classes obviously were going to be canceled for the rest of the week. I was teaching law enforcement cohorts at the time, so obviously things were pretty chaotic at that point, and law enforcement agencies were focusing primarily on preventing any further terrorist attacks. Well, that day, I went to Borders bookstore. They still had freestanding bookstores at that time, Borders bookstore, and I wanted to see if there were any books I could purchase on terrorism because I didn't have that much knowledge. My knowledge was very limited, and I knew that I would need to start reading a lot of journal articles and books and learn a lot very rapidly. That there was no way in the beginning of that time period that I could go on television in an interview and feel comfortable knowing what I was talking about. So what was really interesting is I found one book, The New Terrorism, Fanaticism, and the Arms of Mass Destruction, Walter LeCoeur, and published in 1999. This was the only book, The New Terrorism, that I could find in the entire bookstore. And I looked and looked and looked, and I purchased it. So when I left that bookstore, as far as I know, there were no books on terrorism in that bookstore. And looking at the table of contents at the time, Terrorism in History, Weapons of Mass Destruction, Terrorist Motives, Terror and the Far Right, Religion and Terrorism, State Terrorism, Exotic Terrorism, Terrorism and Organized Crime, Terrorism Today and Tomorrow, and Terrorism of the Future. And I read this book to gain some more knowledge and get some ideas of what journal articles I should start reading, and I kept going back to Borders books quite frequently. And what I noticed is as time went on in that year, that they started getting a lot more books on terrorism, a lot more books, and now you can find lots of books on terrorism in different sections of the bookstore. And I didn't see a lot in the journals either. You might have some articles here or there, but we really have seen recently a greater emphasis on academic studies of terrorism. So that's an interesting article to read. Then I'll just mention another one that I read by Ross, published in 2004, Taking Stock of Research Methods and Analysis on Oppositional Political Terrorism, from the American Sociologist. pages 26 to 37. So it was published back in 2004, so that was a while back. But I think what was interesting is how Dr. Ross presented what he referred to as first tier and second tier research. So, to mention that, first tier research are primary sources, for example, autobiographies, incident reports, hostage experiences, and first-hand accounts of implementing policies. So these techniques are obviously, excuse me, sources are biased toward the author, but can be very useful. And then second tier qualitative research would be data such as biographies or case studies of organizations or case studies of types of terrorism or case studies of specific incidents or case studies of particular regions. And then also quantitative studies would be often content analysis of media coverage and, for example, and also event data analysis. And really, and again, Dr. Ross's article was published in 2004, a while back, but if you start looking at what's available now, when you look at the University of Maryland START program, which I'll link to, I think, in the first week, because there's just a wealth of articles and books and data sets. And so you actually can obtain those data sets and conduct your own quantitative analysis. I did want to mention that Dr. Sherman also has a link or a website in the article that he published that allows you to download his data set for reanalysis or to use it for your own research purposes or whatever the case might be. So think about really, when you start thinking about and reading about research and looking at models, but if you're doing your own research and you're thinking about, well, what kind of data is out there? What kind of methods do you use? I know in my own research, I often will use court documents, the transcripts from the interviews with the perpetrators in preparation for court, the actual court documents of the trials, and I also use data where journalists or researchers have interviewed terrorists or survivors of terrorism attacks, things of that nature. So a lot of times I'll tend to focus more on the qualitative research methodologies, but there's a lot of very helpful research as well in quantitative and looking at risk assessments, looking at trends, patterns, and changes, and looking at all kinds of factors, for example, weapon choice, and we'll see some of those. I'm going to be, referring to and posting both qualitative and quantitative research studies. And I really don't want to give the impression that one's more important than the other. Sometimes you may see that some tend to favor one or the other. I've used both throughout my career, and I find them both useful. Often I find that they answer different questions. When you put them together, you get a better picture of what's going on. So I just thought I'd mention a few things about research methods and terrorism studies, and again, if you look at your basic research methods and think about how they're applied, study some of the models that are presented, and that can be helpful. If you're doing your own research, I often recommend finding some models out there that you can follow, and maybe you're going to do things a little bit differently, but you have a nice baseline, or you at least to see what's been done out there. If you have something completely novel to do, that's very helpful as well. And by all means, I encourage that type of research. So this wraps up this video. Thank you.